Welcome to History 112, Lecture 44, The Rise of the Left. Early in the 1960s, the new left began to emerge as essentially radicalized youth. Now, some were the children of the old left, but most have been drawn in by the civil rights movement, and some were inspired by Marxists like Mao or Ho Chi Minh. Now, the new left is predominantly white, and minorities are going to tend to form their own movements that are more centered on specific issues. And the new left is going to tend to center around university campuses, and a particularly important group is SDS, or the Students for a Democratic Society. And these are groups of students from the nation's most prestigious universities who are going to form as a national organization to mobilize students, and by and large, SDS members are angry about the inability of the United States to secure a lasting peace in Vietnam, the Cold War and threat of World War III, racial injustice, wealth inequality, and so on. One of the first big incidents for the New Left are the Berkeley revolts. Now, at UC Berkeley, historically, students have been banned from fundraising for political causes on campus. And around the same time, there's a number of professors, many of whom were liberals, who have been fired for not taking the loyalty oath. So when a number of students, many of whom had participated in the Freedom Rides, come back and start organizing and fundraising on campus, UC Berkeley decides to strictly enforce the existing regulations. And they extend that strict enforcement onto land that the university owned, but many people assumed was public streets and thought these were places where it was acceptable to engage in fundraising. Now, the flashpoint of this is a civil rights worker is arrested for passing out pamphlets, and about 3,000 angry students surround the police car and prevent it from moving for 32 hours. They only let the car leave once the worker was released. Now, during this time, larger and larger crowds began protesting other university policies, and on several occasions, administration buildings were occupied by students. These were broken up by the police, and mass arrests followed. Now, what the university finally does to settle the issue is they designate certain areas as open forums where students can fundraise and recruit for political causes, and they call these essentially free speech zones. Now, Berkeley becomes a pattern that is going to be followed by other universities when confronted with disgruntled students. It's important to understand that support for left-wing radicals was limited during this time period. Now, there is an ability to mobilize mass numbers, but that always depends on a specific issue, and then when that issue is resolved, that ability to keep those mass numbers there evaporates. Now, anti-militarism is one of the key issues that is able to mobilize people, though, and most supporters of the anti-militarism movement are not going to engage in violence and are going to mainly just be opposed to the war in Vietnam. Now, the elimination of deferments tend to push students into that anti-war movement, and it's also going to lead to a number of draft dodgers who are going to flee the country or go to jail for refusing to serve in the army. And this is important because previously many people, in order to get out of fighting in Vietnam, had used that deferment. In other words, they had gone to college and filed paperwork that said that they could not be drafted until their college degree was over. So many students are going to stay in college as long as possible until they can age out of being drafted. And once that ends, all those students on those campuses who now suddenly are facing the prospect of being drafted are going to be pushed right into this movement. Now, as that expands, many students are also going to protest what they see as university support of war, including things like ROTC programs and laboratories. And some groups like the Weathermen are going to use arson and bombings in an attempt to bring about national revolution. And many of the Weathermen have been founding members of the SDS and become more radicalized when things like the ending of draft deferments really push the anti-militarism movement to the front of many university campuses. While in the early 1960s, the New Left is really centered at places like university campuses, by the mid-1960s, the counterculture has emerged, and that centers around hippies who are going to reject middle-class values and embrace things like long hair, crazy clothes, drugs, free love. And the basic hippie belief is that modern America is hollow and artificial and detached from nature because it's overly materialistic and overly restraining on human behavior. Now, the first big gathering of hippies is going to be in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, and 1967 is going to be nicknamed the Summer of Love, when 100,000 hippies descend on the city. Now, this is going to be a complete contrast to the race riots occurring everywhere else in the country at that time. Now, these hippies are going to live in a more or less self-contained ghetto where they all live communally. And as the Summer of Love ends in 1967, they're going to disperse back across the country and spread hippie culture all around the nation. The Summer of Love had a number of positives. For example, the people come together and create the first free clinics to provide healthcare for those who cannot afford it. And they're also going to spread a lot of new ideas, and it's a big coming together of writers and musicians. And this is going to bring many of the artists together that are going to produce the best and often the most highly political music of the decade. But there were also a downside to the Summer of Love. Many hippies were constantly on the edge of starvation. Many could not find adequate shelter, and the city was overrun by homeless teenagers who were all trying to be part of this movement. And a lot of those homeless teenagers are going to fall prey to charismatic and less than ethical individuals, people like Charles Manson. While the students and the hippies often were the face of the New Left, there were a lot of other movements going on that really were working on trying to bring about positive change. Now, the American Indian movement is one of them, and by the 1960s, we have to understand the position that this group of people were forced to live in. This is less than 1% of the population, but they have an unemployment rate that's 10 times national average. They have the lowest average income. The suicide rate for these individuals is 100 times that of other ethnic groups. And because they're such a small population, only 1%, they're being ignored by the civil rights movement. On top of that, there's a new federal policy called termination, where Native American tribes are no longer being recognized as separate entities and were becoming part of the state in which they were geographically located, and they were being expected to move to cities and assimilate. Now, due to widespread corruption and abuses and protests from Native American tribes, Eisenhower permits terminations to continue only if the tribe agrees, so the federal policy got put essentially on hold. But out of all of this and the protests, the Indian civil rights movement is going to go ahead and grow. Now, there is a big summit in Chicago with 400 representatives from 61 tribes, and they issue a statement wherein they demand the right to choose their own way of life. And there's an immediate impact of the Native American movement on Hollywood. This is when they stop making cowboy and Indian movies. Other institutions are going to be pressured into ending demeaning depictions of Native Americans as well. And by 1968, young militants are going to come together and establish AIM, or the American Indian Movement, and they're going to pressure Congress into passing the Indian Civil Rights Act, which recognizes the legitimacy of tribal law. And 1968 is also going to see some clashes over fishing rights and the Alcatraz sit-in, whereas a major protest, AIM members go out to the recently abandoned prison in Alcatraz and set up shop there based on a claim of discovery in much the same way as Europeans had done when they first came to the Americas in the 15 and 1600s. Now, Nixon is going to respond to this by appointing the first Native American to a position of Commissioner of Indian Affairs and promise increased tribal self-government. Now, around this same time, AIM members are also going to seize the town of Wounded Knee, which had been where the Wounded Knee massacre had occurred almost 100 years before, and that's the real watershed event for Native American history. It's the point at which all Native American resistance is essentially broken and all people are forced onto reservations. Now, it's highly symbolic that they would meet there, and they're going to demand that the U.S. government honor the past treaties, and they're going to clash with federal troops, and a number of people are going to be killed. Now, following that, the Supreme Court is going to intervene, and they're going to rule in a couple of key cases. One, that Congress does not have the right to terminate tribal governments, and two, that Indian nations have rights to land based on treaties. As the idea of activism is spreading, one of the biggest groups to come into this is Latinos, and they're the fastest growing immigrant group in the nation, although they're growing on the East Coast and the West Coast for very different reasons. On the East Coast, there's large numbers of immigrants coming from Puerto Rico seeking better jobs, and those individuals are American citizens, and there's also large numbers coming from Cuba who are fleeing the Castro regime. Now, on the West Coast is a very different issue because the West Coast and the Southwest are being driven largely by immigration from Mexico, and many of these individuals were recent immigrants under the Bracero program, which allowed people to come on a work permit. And when that program is canceled, many individuals are going to stay, and others are going to continue to come, although now without papers. Now, large numbers are also going to be fleeing some corrupt and oppressive Latin American regimes, but by and large, immigration from Mexico is what's really driving the growth in the Latino community on the West Coast. It's also important to know that starting in 1953, the federal government is going to begin trying to deport undocumented workers, but is never going to be all that successful, and the number of people without papers is going to continue to grow throughout this time period. Now, the more established immigrants, and certainly by the second or third generation, are going to tend to live in cities and have okay jobs, and some are even going to be very wealthy. But the newer immigrants tend to be poor and have low levels of education. Now, while some are going to find work in industrial jobs, most are going to work in low-paying service jobs with no benefit or security, and language and cultural barriers are often going to discourage effective union organization. However, Cesar Chavez comes into this, and he is the most successful organizer for this community, and by 1965, his union, the United Farm Workers, is going to go on strike demanding recognition and better wages and benefits. And they're going to use various civil rights organizations to organize nationwide boycotts of grapes and lettuce. And Cesar Chavez himself was going to go on a 25-day hunger strike in 1968, and even Bobby Kennedy is going to get involved in this. Now, as a result of these efforts, by 1970, half of the growers in the country had signed contracts with the UFW, who's going to use that leverage as a union and use that leverage in the food producing industry to also make civil rights gains for the Latino community, who was by and large who the United Farm Workers membership was. One of the other important groups at the front of the civil rights movement during the 1960s is second wave feminism and then later the women's liberation movement. Now, in 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, and she is going to document and discuss the problems of traditional roles faced by many women, especially a lack of happiness and fulfillment in their lives. At the same time, JFK is going to bring in things like the President's Commission on the Status of Women, also passed the Equal Pay Act. In 1964, Title VI extends civil rights protections for minorities to women, and in 1966, Betty Friedan is going to bring together a group of feminists to form NOW, under the theory that there's no civil rights movement to speak for women as there has been from other victims of discrimination. Now, by 1970, however, the movement takes on a new life and becomes the women's liberation movement, and younger women are going to come and dominate this. And the young leaders are going to want an assault on male domination as they see it. So they're going to often reject marriage, family, and heterosexual relationships. Now, they are going to achieve some major things. Affirmative action programs are going to be extended to women. All male institutions are going to begin to disappear throughout the country. And they're going to attempt, albeit unsuccessfully, to revive the Equal Rights Amendments in the Constitution. Now, some other things that happen as a result of both second wave feminism and the women's liberation movement is that two-income families become normal by the 1970s, and Miss and Mrs. tend to be replaced with Ms. In addition, increasing number of women in elected offices and high-level appointments. You see the first Supreme Court justice by 1981. You see the first female vice presidential candidate in 1984. But we also have to understand that they're going to bring in some things that are also highly controversial. And there are two really important Supreme Court cases that go with second wave feminism and go with women's liberation that you definitely need to know about. One is Griswold v. Connecticut, and it is going to hold that privacy is a protected right and that laws banning contraceptives are unconstitutional because under the Constitution and the way they interpreted it, they assume an implied right to privacy, and therefore, since you have a right to privacy, this means the state cannot interfere in your medical decisions because medical decisions are inherently private and they rule contraception to be a medical decision. In other words, the state has no right to interfere. It's between you and your doctor. In 1973, Roe v. Wade, which is the most controversial Supreme Court case of all time, is going to extend that right to privacy to specifically include abortion. The gay liberation movement also begins around the same time, and until 1960s, most LGBT people lived in secret. Harassment by police and violence against these individuals was very common. The police would regularly raid gay bars, beat and arrest those inside. Now, this leads to the Stonewall riot. In 1969, the police raid the Stonewall Inn in New York City, and a massive crowd gathers and attacks the police and riot throughout the night, and this becomes a rallying cry for the movement. And one of the key things for the gay liberation movement is coming out, and the movement is going to go forward and help persuade many people to stop living in secret, and it becomes essentially part of this new liberation movement that people want to live openly. And as more people live openly, there is over time an increased acceptance by society that follows. But it's going to take till the 1990s for anti-discrimination legislation to catch up, and this is going to still evoke strong emotions in certain areas. Now, the last big protest movement in the 1960s is environmentalism, although this one has its roots much earlier on. But until the mid-20th century, it had been about aesthetics, preserving pretty places, and it was outgrowth of increased scientific interest in ecology. But by the 1960s, there's increased understanding of the integrated aspects of various species in the environment, and people are going to go ahead and start paying attention to pollution and environmental damage. And what really spurs it on is the Cuyahoga River catching fire repeatedly, and this is going to lead to increased governmental regulation about environmental impacts. And here we have a picture of them trying to put out burning water, and most of America recognizes that water should not burn, and so there becomes a movement to clean up the rivers and deal with pollution, and even Richard Nixon is going to get in on this and create the Environmental Protection Agency. So what's the big idea here? Well, everything starts with civil rights issues and grows into people looking for an acceptance of diverse lifestyles. And many groups are going to make a varying degree of progress. White middle-class university students are going to be looking for what they see as social justice, while hippies are going to reject middle-class values. Native Americans are going to demand the right to live as they choose, while Latinos are going to demand equal rights and focus on workplace issues at first. Women are going to demand equal protection under the law, as will the LGBT community demand acceptance. And people are going to become concerned with pollution. And overall, what we're really seeing is people want the right to live the way they want to live and be accepted and be happy. See you in the next lecture.